Welcome to Ripon, a historic cathedral city nestled among the gorgeous North Yorkshire countryside, and today, the third smallest city in all of England. An enchanting city of cobbled lanes and centuries-old buildings, Ripon is a place absolutely full of history, and as we take a walk through its streets on this beautifully sunny afternoon, we'll take a look back through time at the origins of this peculiarly petite city, and visit some of Ripon's main sites, the most famous of which is of course the one towering above us here. Both the largest and most important building in the city, this is Ripon Cathedral, a magnificent landmark that has a history dating back over 1300 years. In the context of that lengthy history, this gorgeous building that we can see here is relatively new, being the fourth church to have stood on this site, and having begun construction 842 years ago in the year 1180 AD. The building of the cathedral into its present form took nearly 400 years, completed in the mid-16th century, although at that time it was also topped with a mighty spire on the main tower that we can see around the corner here, but it sadly collapsed in the year 1660. For much of its life, however, Ripon Cathedral wasn't a cathedral at all. In fact, that status wasn't conferred to it until 1836, but it was a minster, the signal of a parish church with particular significance. But why was Ripon's church so significant? Well, to understand, we have to go back 1,350 years to the year 672 AD, when a church was first built on the site. Before then, this was the site of a monastery established by Scottish monks, and its abbot, St. Wilfrid, decided to build a new stone church, and part of it still remains to this day. That would be the old crypt, built underneath the church in the 7th century, and which amazingly still exists to this day. We'll explain more about St. Wilfrid's crypt in a moment, but across the road here, we're looking at the Old Deanery, a wonderful house originally built in the early 17th century as the residence of the Dean of Ripon, the foremost clergyman associated with the then minster. After 1941, however, the Old Deanery was turned into a venue and hotel, with some great views of the cathedral out of the window. But the Old Deanery isn't the only historic building you'll find on the perimeter of Ripon's cathedral. Just in front of us here is Ripon's old Courthouse, built in 1830, and which operated until 1998, after which point it became a museum. But for centuries beforehand, another, much older courthouse stood in this part of Ripon. Positioned here, it was located within the old summer palace of the Archbishop of York, and for the best part of a millennium, an independent legal system was practiced within the courthouse, known as the Ripon Liberty. The liberty was a privilege likely granted to Ripon back in the 10th century, and it was in place until 1888, serving as another symbol of the significance of this place over time. But as we pass by the entrance to the historic medieval courthouse, it's Ripon's cathedral which is undoubtedly the most important symbol of the city's history. The original stone church built by St. Wilfrid in 672 AD was destroyed nearly 300 years later, burned down by King Edred of the English, said to have been a warning to the Archbishop of York concerning the growth of Viking control in what was then the Kingdom of Northumbria. The church was replaced, but it too fell soon after, destroyed in the year 1069 by William the Conqueror's Norman forces during the campaign known as the Harrying of the North, which devastated much of this region. A few years later, in 1080, another church was built, but it was eventually replaced by the magnificent building we know today, designed to promote pilgrimages to the tomb of St. Wilfrid, whose crypt beneath the church somehow survived all of the attacks on the site through the centuries. There's even more history behind Ripon Cathedral, and we'll talk more about the city's most famous landmark as we continue our walk. But for now, we'll make our way up the delightful Kirkgate towards the marketplace and the very heart of modern Ripon. Here though, we're looking at a small archway that, in the medieval era, served as an entrance to the Archbishop of York's splendid palace, which for a long time was his richest estate. Over time, however, the Archbishop's palace was gradually destroyed. The archway here on Kirkgate was later used as an entrance to the stable yard of the Unicorn Inn, and the palace itself was initially damaged by Scottish raids in the early 14th century, before being converted into a poorhouse and then eventually demolished entirely in 1830. But while the once mighty palace is long gone, there are still more stories and traces of the past to be found here on Kirkgate, including in the form of the buildings that line the street and that are now occupied by shops. These lovely shops here, for example, are housed within a building that was once the heart of local law and order in the 19th century, once serving as the town council house, and afterwards the borough police station, complete with cells, and rather efficiently, a place for the town's fire engine to be parked too. Just across the street from that building, there stands the Royal Oak Pub, which has operated here in the heart of Ripon for centuries. Most famously, it's thought that the pub was visited in the 1640s by King Charles I, although this was no grand official visit. The reality was rather that Charles likely came to the Royal Oak to drown his sorrows in the summer of 1644 at the height of the English Civil War, after he had lost the crucial Battle of Marston Moor, fought on the outskirts of York, and which proved a crucial turning point in the conflict, as the Royalists' loss saw them lose control of the north of England, which up until then had been a vital stronghold for them in the war. Now, having started out at the cathedral and the area of Ripon historically dominated by religion, we've made our way up along Kirkgate, the main arm connecting the religious heart of the city with its commercial hub, Ripon's impressive, wide-open marketplace. Admittedly, the marketplace, as the very heart of the city, more has the feel of a countryside market town, though we'll explain exactly why this place is a city a little later on. But the marketplace is still full of interesting little gems, such as this colourful shelter that was built in 1911 for cabmen waiting for fares from here on the marketplace. Though having fallen into disrepair in the late 20th century, it's been lovingly restored, and it's just one of the many eye-catching landmarks here at the heart of the city. Towering at the heart of the marketplace is Ripon's enormous obelisk, originally built all the way back in 1703 on the site of the town's old market cross, and it now stands as a monument to William Aislabie, who served as the MP for Ripon for 60 years straight. Standing just opposite the obelisk, meanwhile, is Ripon's beautiful town hall, built back in 1799 and later described by the writer Daniel Defoe as the finest town hall in England. At the top of the building, you'll also notice that it reads, "Except the Lord keep the city, the Wakeman waketh in vain." Based on a Bible verse, this is the motto of the city of Ripon, and it refers to the legendary duties of the city's famous Wakeman. In a 1,136-year-long tradition that still takes place to this day, the Wakeman, also known as the Ripon Hornblower, arrives every day onto the marketplace at 9 p.m, where he blows his horn at the four corners of the obelisk in a ceremony known as setting the watch. The point of this ceremony was for the Wakeman, who served in a position much like a night watchman, would signal to the people of Ripon that he was awake and alert, watching over the town so that they could sleep soundly through the night. Opposite us on the corner of the marketplace is the Wakeman's house, one of the oldest buildings in Ripon city centre today, built around the turn of the 17th century. Now used as a cafe, it takes its name from the fact that it was once owned by Hugh Ripley, the first mayor of Ripon and the so-called last Wakeman of Ripon. While Wakemen still sound the horn in Ripon today, Hugh Ripley is often called the last Wakeman because before he became mayor, he had the power to serve fines and lay down orders in the town, though this jurisdiction came to an end in 1604. But as we mentioned, the history of the Wakeman of Ripon goes back well over 1,000 years, and the origins for this famous tradition make for a fascinating tale. We'll talk more about the origins of the Wakeman in a short while, but here beside the marketplace, we're looking down through another historic archway. This one in the medieval era having been an old burgage property, a long piece of land stretching back from the marketplace that was rented from the king. And later, it was the site of a pub, by the name of the York Minster Inn. You'll find a number of pubs around Ripon's historic marketplace, but there's far more to this part of the city than just the buildings that surround it. For instance, markets, as you'd expect, are still held here every week on Thursdays, while this place also plays home to the annual celebration known as the Wilfrid Procession, which has taken place since the year 1108 in honour of the abbot of the old monastery, St Wilfrid, who's often considered to be the founder of Ripon as we know it today. Back across the marketplace here, though, we find a delightful set of historic buildings. On the far right is the Unicorn Hotel, an old coaching inn built in the 18th century. A couple of doors along, where the supermarket is, was once another pub known as the Crown Inn, and next door to it is the popular Appleton's Butchers, which has been operating in Ripon since 1867, and next door to it is the town's old bank, built back in 1785. There's a wide range of shops to be found in Ripon that cater to its population of around 16,000 people, but when ranked by population, that makes Ripon by far one of the country's smallest cities. Ripon is the 7th smallest city in the UK, and the 3rd smallest in England, behind Wells down in Somerset, and weirdly, the City of London, though that city only covers the historic square mile that makes up a tiny part of London as we know it today. But how did Ripon, which has all the hallmarks of a historic market town, end up as a city? Well, for much of its life, Ripon was actually a town, but in 1836, Ripon Minster was designated as Ripon Cathedral, which according to the old conventions of city status in Britain, you'd think would have automatically made Ripon a city. Well, the local council thought so too, and they began calling themselves the City of Ripon straight away. But it soon emerged that, as is still the case today, the rules dictated that you have to first petition the monarch before gaining city status. So about 30 years after having started calling themselves a city, Ripon did just that, officially gaining their much sought after city status in 1865. Now, having made our way off the marketplace, we find ourselves at a rather unremarkable looking alleyway, but which is known by the rather delightful name Lavender Alley. As lovely as that sounds though, Lavender Alley was a name likely given to this alley as a joke, as this was once a particularly dingy thoroughfare running through an area packed with houses, outside of which many people would dump their waste. Fortunately, that's no longer a common problem on Lavender Alley, and while the centre of Ripon may not be made up of many streets, they are rather lovely, including North Street here, which is lined with yet more shops, even home to the only cinema in the city, and which stretches out towards the northern side of town and the River Ure, one of two rivers that encircle Ripon, the other being the Skell to the south side of town. Ripon's waterways have long played a big part in the history of the city, with a canal opened in 1773 to better link the city with York, and the River Ure having once formed the border between the historic North and West Ridings of Yorkshire. Now originally, Ripon was a part of the old, much larger West Riding of Yorkshire, but today it lies in the modern ceremonial county of North Yorkshire. Despite this, its position on that historic border between ridings was nothing new, as back in the 9th century, Ripon found itself caught between the territory of the marauding Vikings and the newly emerging nation of England. And this, rather surprisingly, brings us back to the origins of the Ripon hornblower. As we mentioned, the Wakeman of Ripon has been blowing his horn every day at 9 PM for 1,136 years, ever since the year 886 AD. Now just 8 years before then, the King of Wessex, Alfred the Great, had forced the Vikings out of London and made an agreement with them that allowed them to keep territory in the north and east of England, known as the Danelaw. But Ripon, while falling within the boundaries of the Viking-controlled Danelaw, was known to Alfred as a friend of the Saxons to the south, and Ripon would often report back to Alfred on what the Vikings were up to. So, in return for the town's goodwill, King Alfred the Great granted Ripon a charter horn, a symbolic gift to be given to its Wakeman. That original horn is said to be kept inside the town hall, but Wakemen still blow a new horn every day, over a millennium later. Now we've made our way out of the very centre of Ripon to find ourselves on Allhallowgate, where we're looking at a former Victorian workhouse built in 1854, where the poor of the then still technically a town would live and work, albeit in often rather squalid conditions. Today, the building is a museum, which has beautifully preserved the interior appearance of a Victorian-era workhouse, and where you can learn a little bit about the history of Ripon's industrial legacy. Now, unlike much of Yorkshire, which boomed dramatically during the Industrial Revolution, Ripon was a place that went largely untouched by large-scale industrialisation. Historically, there wasn't all too much manufacturing going on here in Ripon, the most notable being the production of spurs, metal accessories used for riding horses, which took place here from the 16th century onwards. The canal may have provided an easier link for trade with the big city of York, but given its rather isolated geographical position, Ripon didn't see a dramatic development of industry like elsewhere in the county. However, centuries before the onset of the Industrial Revolution, a community of monks outside Ripon did play a major part in bringing wealth to the medieval town. These were the monks of the Fountains Abbey, an enormous Cistercian monastery about 3 miles to the southwest of Ripon that was founded in 1132, and which rose to become one of the most notable and wealthiest monasteries in medieval England. Founded by a number of monks who had become tired of the excesses of their fellows in the city of York, the Fountains Abbey was designed to be a place for simple, devout worship. In the first century of its existence, Fountains Abbey developed quickly and impressively, growing not just in scale and numbers, but coming to play a significant role in medieval Ripon, with its monks and important lay brothers, or labourers, building shelters and providing daily food for the poor of Ripon and surrounding villages, while they also developed a number of successful trades that brought in good income, including the production of wool, lead mining, cattle rearing, stone quarrying, and more. This helped the Fountains Abbey to become a notoriously wealthy monastery, but it didn't last forever. In the 14th century, the abbey was devastated with bad harvests, the onset of the Black Death, and regular raiding by Scots pushing deep into northern England, all of which caused major financial problems. Things were getting better around the turn of the 16th century, but King Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries campaign put an abrupt end to that, closing the abbey down in 1539 and leaving it to ruin. But amazingly, nearly 500 years after it was closed, the Fountains Abbey is still standing, and along with the newer and beautifully laid out Studley Royal Gardens, it's one of the best places to explore if you're in the Ripon area, as one of the most complete monasteries in the entire country. But as we continue to make our way along Allhallowgate here, how exactly do you get to Ripon if you want to visit the Fountains Abbey and the many other captivating landmarks in this smaller than usual city? Well, the city is located about 10 miles to the north of the famous spa town of Marygate, and is bordered to the west by the famously wild Yorkshire Dales. And in these depths of the countryside, there aren't all too many public transport options. Once upon a time, there was a station here in Ripon, but it closed down in the late 1960s, so your best bet is the direct bus from Harrogate and Leeds, which runs every day, or a number of other less than regular buses from the likes of York, Richmond and Northallerton, though remember to check the timetables if you do take them. That being said, tentative plans are in place to bring the railways back to Ripon in the future, although that is thought to be more than 10 years away. But while it may not be the easiest place to get to for all travellers, Ripon is more than worth the trip, with a gorgeous surrounding landscape peppered with landmarks like Fountains Abbey, and a charming city centre filled to the brim with history. There's yet more to the story of this city that we haven't delved into, but we'll do so as we make our way back around towards the cathedral, where we'll be ending our walk in just over 5 minutes' time. Here on St Marygate, however, we find yet another popular attraction in Ripon, a former prison turned police station that's now another captivating museum. Now, the prison was built in 1816 as an extension to the old House of Correction, built next door back in the year 1686. Together, they made up the so-called Liberty Prison of Ripon, Liberty referring to the independent legal system that we mentioned earlier, as contradictory as the prison's name may sound. The prison here operated until 1878, after which point it became a police station, which was in operation until 1956. Nowadays, the old prison and police station exist as a museum, where you can walk through the corridors of the prison and experience the grim cells inside, as the museum is a great window into the world of a Victorian prison, much like the beautifully preserved Workhouse Museum. Over the years, many people tried under Ripon's independent liberty jurisdiction were held at the prison. But before the prison was built, this city also took on a rather famous prisoner in the form of King Charles I. A few years after he had visited the Royal Oak on Kirkgate to drown his sorrows, Charles found himself back in Ripon, albeit this time in even worse circumstances, having been taken prisoner by the parliamentarians at the end of the English Civil War, which he had lost. Charles was kept as a prisoner here in Ripon for 2 days before being moved along, but it's fair to say that he didn't have the best luck with this city, as a major event took place a number of years before that humiliated the king. As we walked through this spacious city centre car park back towards the cathedral, it was further along St Marygate there that one of the most important treaties of the 17th century was signed, the Treaty of Ripon. In 1629, 4 years after having ascended to the throne, Charles I made the bombshell decision to indefinitely adjourn England's Parliament, and ruled over the country according to his own conscience, during a period known as personal rule, or to his enemies, the 11 Years' Tyranny. But it wasn't just England that Charles reigned over, as both Scotland and Ireland also existed under the rule of his crown. And during his period of personal rule, Charles sought to impose reforms that sat particularly poorly with each of the different nations. Most infamously, he attempted to dictate the manner of Christian worship to be aligned in all 3 of his kingdoms, and this enraged many Presbyterian worshippers in Scotland, known as the Covenanters, who believed the king's religious leanings to be too close to Catholicism. Charles took this outrage in Scotland to be a rebellion against his rule, and so a war broke out between the king's armies and the Scottish Covenanters, which, embarrassingly for Charles, he lost in 1640. The Scots, having actually taken territory as far south as County Durham, and threatening to take control of the significant city of York, pushed the king into negotiations to prevent a heavier defeat, and they demanded that he recall England's Parliament for the first time in 11 years, to bring an end to his era of tyranny. On the 28th of October 1640, these terms and more humiliating agreements were put in place by the signing of the Treaty of Ripon just a few streets away, and so the Covenanters took victory in the war, while Charles reluctantly brought an angered Parliament back to work. But as a result of the treaty's terms, Charles found himself in a situation where he could no longer dissolve the Parliament at his own will again, reducing his power significantly and increasing the power of Parliament, a dispute that eventually escalated further and further before boiling over into the English Civil War, which broke out in 1642. Having navigated our way through that car park and back past the old courthouse, the legacy of Ripon's involvement in the English Civil War, while not militarily significant, is just one part of this city's enthralling history. From its origins over 1300 years ago with the building of the first church just here, to the tale of the Saxons and the Vikings and the beginning of the tradition of the Ripon hornblower, and the beautiful Fountains Abbey, and many more riveting stories that we haven't even had time to mention, Ripon may be a small city, but it's a place with a big history. And so, having made a loop of the very centre of England's beautiful third smallest city, we find ourselves back by Ripon Cathedral, where we've reached the end of our walk for today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're looking forward to visiting Ripon for yourself sometime soon.